Hi everyone, my name is Bora Kim. Thank you so much for coming here, joining us tonight. And thanks so much for Hopelab for hosting this amazing event. As you know, mental health issue is a growing global crisis, and by only helping each other and learning from each other, we can influence the much needed change needed in the mental health space. So we organized this event to provide a space where aspiring and early stage founder of mental health startup can learn from seasoned professionals in the mental health tech industry. And we have amazing panelists here tonight. And it wasn't intentional, but they all happen to be a woman. Yeah. We need more female leaders. Yes. So before we jump right in, I'd like to introduce you to a co-founder of HackMentalHealth organization, who made this event possible. This is Ed.
Hi everyone. First, I won't derail you guys from the panel. My name is Anna Wu. My co-founder is Steven Kamieta. He'll be here in a bit. But just want to say thank you guys so much for coming. We are so excited to collaborate with Hopelab. Hopelab was actually one of our amazing sponsors at our mental health hackathon earlier this year at UCSF. We host the world's largest mental health hackathon. We had over 500 participants this year, and I see a couple familiar faces, so great to see you guys at our community events. We have a lot more in store for you guys this year, so I hope you guys have all signed up on our listserv and joined our Facebook page to stay updated. But without further ado, I'd like to introduce Danielle Ramo, the Director of Research Operations here at Hopelab, and she'll be moderating the panel this evening. Thank you guys so much for being here.
Thank you, Bora and Anne. Thank you, Hack Mental Health. This is an amazing opportunity for Hopelab to be able to host this panel tonight, talking about the digital mental health space. Some of you may already have startups. Some of you may be thinking about starting a startup in digital mental health. And it's a really unique space compared to other opportunities out there if you want to start a company. We have 3 experts that really represent different areas of starting a company, investing in companies, helping incubate companies, and they're here tonight to share their perspectives. I'd just like to share a quick note about Hack Mental Health. So I'm a clinical psychologist by training, and I left a faculty position at UCSF last August to join Hopelab full-time. It's been an amazing ride, and I'm very happy to say that we're a unique model here at Hopelab. We're a social innovation lab. We build technology-based solutions to support adolescent health and emotional well-being. I knew when I came to Hopelab that I wanted to connect with Hack Mental Health immediately. I knew what they were doing. There were a lot of people that were interested and had a lot of energy behind hacking solutions related to the mental health space. But I had no idea how powerful it was until I had the honor of being a judge at their events last month in San Francisco. Not only did Steven and Anne pull off 2 hackathons with 500 participants across the country 2 times in a month, but the energy, the precision with which that event was run was absolutely outstanding. So we were just so happy to partner with them for this event tonight. So let's jump in and talk to our panelists. I will let them introduce themselves because if I attempted to do so, I couldn't possibly do it justice. And I'd like to start with Margaret Laws, President and CEO of Hopelab.
Thank you very much, Danielle. And thanks to all of you. This is really exciting. Just the energy in this room is fantastic. We're really excited to host this, as Danielle points out, is one of the key areas of our work at Hopelab. So we're just so kind of touched and excited to see this energy in the room and to see all of you guys who are engaged on this journey with us. So a little bit about me. I'm President and CEO of Hopelab. I've been here for 4 years, and I lead the work across the organization. Prior to that, I was at the California Healthcare Foundation for a long time. In the last 5 years there, I started and ran a social venture fund investing in solutions, services and technology solutions to help improve access to and lower costs of healthcare. So we did a lot of looking at mental and behavioral health solutions there. I continue to advise that fund as well as Acumen America, which is another mission fund, and a number of others around the country. And I also, part of the year, teach in a course called Startup Garage at Stanford Business School. So I spend quite a lot of time working with early stage founders and aspiring entrepreneurs. And so spend a lot of time also just thinking about the nuts and bolts of how to start a venture, get financing, develop business plans. So hopefully I'll be able to offer some perspective from social venture and from early stage venture and the kind of world of social innovation.
And next, Alyson Friedensohn, who is co-founder of Modern Health.
Yes. Hey guys, excited to be here. This is awesome how many people are there here. So I used to come to these meetups like 5 years ago and there'd be 4 of us. And we pretty much would just look at each other and be like, okay, it's gonna work out well. So this is awesome that there's this many of you. It's super inspiring for me to see this and now be on this side. Bit about me. So one of the co-founders and CEO of Modern Health. My background's in the healthcare and benefit space. So to take a step back a little bit, I wanted to be a doctor. I was pre-med, went to Johns Hopkins, realized I wanted to find a way to make an impact at a more macro scale. My parents are physicians, and I just kind of saw the struggle it was being a clinician. Not that I ever was one, but just being able to make an impact and not have to focus on kind of the issues that we all deal with in the healthcare system. And so I always wanted to start a company. Booked a one-way ticket out here, San Francisco, about 6 years ago, and had no idea what I was doing. So I worked at a startup to kind of figure out what a startup even meant. And then the most recent startup before starting Modern Health, I worked at Collective Health. If you guys have heard of that, big digital health company, and gave me really a front row seat to the exact problem we're solving now in the mental health space. So just high level overview of Modern Health. Our whole kind of idea, our ethos is taking a more holistic and proactive approach to mental well-being. How many of you have mental health? Not a trick question. Everything I want to know is all of us. So we think about mental health the same as physical health, right? We all have it. It's just a matter of where you fall. And that spectrum of green to red, right? We kind of ebb and flow, same as our physical health. And so not only offering solutions to folks who might be in that red and the crisis zone, if you will, but also giving ourselves the tools to be resilient to the stress and struggles that we all live in today's world, which is kind of the reality, which is fine. It's all going to be good. We recently closed our Series A with Kleiner Perkins, so we've raised about $11.5 million to date. We're about 30 people. Our office is down the street. We're hiring, so if you want to come work, please hit me up. But yeah, super excited to be here. Super pumped that there's an entire female panel here. I recently read a stat, which was there needs to be more female leaders, but only 2% of VC funding in all of 2018 and 2019 has gone to an entirely female-founded team. Crazy. But we're proud to be in that 2%. We have an entirely female-founded team. So I encourage all the women out there to get after it. Let's get that number higher. But pumped to be here.
Thanks, Alyson. And last but not least is Sarah Seegal, co-founder of Affect Mental Health.
Hey.
Hi guys. With a fan club.
Yeah, I got a fan club. It's really great to see you guys. Thanks so much for coming out. I'm at Affect Mental Health, which is an incubator for mental health companies. So if anyone's an early stage mental health company or trying to figure out how to do some sort of pivot and need some help, let us know. My background is I thought I wanted to be a clinician because that seemed like one of the most impactful things I could possibly do. And got really good advice early on in my career when I was in school, which was work with lots of different settings and see who you might want to work with, what you might want to specialize in. Just a little research-oriented advice. And what I ended up seeing again and again was how broken the system was and how many really well-intentioned, well-trained clinicians and researchers, practitioners were out there, but how the system just kept failing everyone. And so I think there's some commonality in that theme across the panel. And so my work has been the last 10 years, where is there an opportunity to do the right thing and find a way to support that? So it's crossed over with technology and with the venture capital world. The first company, I was the first employee of a company called Breakthrough, which is telemedicine for behavioral health that we started in 2009, which got acquired by a more general telehealth company called MD Live. And that was my front row seat to what does it mean to do a startup? What is technology? What is venture capital? What is design? What is product engineers? Ooh, Ruby on Rails. I gotta figure out what that is. Those are all gems, diamonds, things like that. A little bit. And then I was at One Medical from the early days to scaling it to become an actual company where I also learned a lot. And then most recently was at Lantern and then doing consulting and this. And I have a partner on the East Coast who's a MD PhD. He works with me as well. So really psyched to be here. And you guys had some amazing questions. I heard there were 1,000 questions that were submitted. And there was
get to all
very diligent work that went into clustering them. So that even though all 1,000 questions didn't get answered or won't be asked, hopefully, they're well represented. So thank you guys for taking the time to do that.
Let's see what we can do.
We'll be here all night.
So in addition to the 1,000 questions we're about to ask and answer in the next 50 minutes, I also want to reflect how many applicants we got to this event. Way more than we were ever able to fit in this space. So not only are you the chosen few, but your excitement and your questions were outstanding. And I just wanted to share that I think that reflects the uniqueness of the digital mental health space right now. So no longer are there going to be 4 people in a meetup, but there are hundreds that wanted to be here tonight. That reflects 2 things, both the need and the opportunity in the digital mental health space. 46 million Americans are diagnosed with a mental health problem right now. And there's a recognition that technology-delivered solutions offer unprecedented opportunity to meet a need that is as yet unmet. There are few mental health professionals compared to those who actually have problems that need evidence-based treatment in order to reduce mental health problems. So if technology can help, is it that easy? Well, of course not. Right? Mental health brings not only things like stigma that vastly outweighs that of traditional health problems and other areas that one might choose to have a startup, but unique legal and ethical challenges. And for those of us at Hopelab that focus on the youth, adolescent, and young adult space, there are even further challenges, I think, than for those who are working primarily with adults. So that clearly hasn't stopped anyone in this room, and it clearly hasn't stopped the panel tonight, but it really means that digital mental health is different from a lot of other areas in which we all could choose to spend our days. So I'd like to start by asking all of the panel a question about the uniqueness of the digital mental health space. How can we balance the desire to support people's mental health and the need for companies at the end of the day to survive, to produce a return on investment? So Margaret, you've had a perspective on this from the investment space. How are you thinking about that when a founder comes to you and says, I want to make the world a better place, and I know I need to make money?
Yeah, so it's a great question. And what I was saying, we were just talking about this before, this is actually the 3rd conversation about this topic that I've had today. So it's very much alive in the waters that I'm swimming in right now. So a couple of things I would say. Now, the first thing I would say is I have a couple of people sitting next to me who are or have been in digital mental health companies that are actually out there in the market, have raised money, and are working with people and really delivering value. So I want to start with optimism. I also want to say that one of the biggest challenges of any company in a commercial market or in the public sector market is the challenge of the incentives on the other side, whether that other side, that buyer is an employer, an insurance company, a state Medicaid agency, even a nonprofit organization. And I think that the question of demonstrating a return on investment is particularly challenging in a space like mental health, where so much of what we do and what we want to do and what we care about doing is preventing bad things from happening, not reacting to or responding to bad things that have You've obviously got both. And so I think one of the real challenges of this space is to be able to make the value proposition or business case for a solution or an intervention that is largely preventive. And so I think Alyson and Sarah can certainly tell some stories about that are a little more specific. But one of the things, I said this before, I can't remember which organization it was. It was a social innovation organization that works on new technologies. And they use this mantra where they say, who's going to use, who's going to choose, and who's going to pay the dues. And so when you think about a company in this space, you got to be able to answer all three of those questions. And often because we work with young people, when we think about who's going to use, the user may be a young person, the chooser may be a parent, or it may be a school, or it may be for someone working, it may be an employer. And who's going to pay and why are they going to pay? So having an answer to those questions is really important. And I think one of the things that gives me optimism, and one of the things that I try to think hard about, is where are some entry points into people who can pay, or organizations that have an incentive to pay that may not be the traditional, most commercial insurers, systems, employers. Where are some places where there are socially motivated entities that have the ability to experiment and have the ability to test out some new ways of looking at return on investment? So there are a number of efforts right now in the mental and the emotional health space. I think many of you are probably familiar with some of them. Pivotal Ventures is doing a lot of work in this area, in teen, young adult, and they're going to be doing both some investment in early stage companies as well as some more incubation stage work, where they really are trying to help early stage companies experiment with demonstrating value. But I think I'll stop at that and just say that the big question
we'll get more.
But the big question that I really think about is how are you demonstrating value to whom? And are there people out there, entities out there that have the incentives to actually recognize and care about that value? And I think Alyson can probably talk a little bit about that in her case. And I think it's probably a good handout to you.
Sure. Thank you. So yeah, I think one of the biggest challenges is especially in the healthcare system, just broadly speaking, is building a system where incentives are aligned, right? I think that's part of the problem with the traditional healthcare system is incentives aren't aligned with providers, the end user, employers, the payers. And especially in the mental health space, what we found is that, when we think about mental health, typically, and the stigma is being reduced, which is great, but people think mental illness, they think people in crisis mode. Well, the reality is to treat people in crisis mode is pretty expensive. So the traditional way is high cost psychotherapy, and really high quality providers, as we know, they're expensive. And not only that, there's actually a finite number of them, and there's a shortage to meet the ever increasing demand. And so what's happened is we've had this kind of supply and demand issue where there's an increase in demand of folks that are dealing with depression, anxiety, and so forth, and there's a shortage of supply. It's the reimbursement rates of health insurance are so low, so you have clinical, high quality clinical psychologists who have people who are willing to pay $250 an hour. And so what happens is it creates this whole supply and demand issue. The price keeps going up, and then really who ends up seeing them is just who can afford them. It's not necessarily based on clinical need. And so all of this is obviously exasperated by the fact that we haven't set up a system that supports therapists to actually just focus on delivering care and getting people better, right? The incentives aren't aligned. And so what we've done differently is, instead of thinking about, okay, we just need to create access to these high quality providers, because again, the reality is there's actually a shortage. And article just came out, 40% of clinical psychologists are actually on track to retire in the next 5 years with no one to backfill. I'm not sure if I should send you this research article. It's kind of crazy to think about, right? And so the whole idea behind modern health is, let's reserve those who need that kind of care for those who really need it, right? And so the way that we think about solving mental health is very similar to physical health, in that there's a spectrum, and we all fall somewhere in that spectrum. We think about it from green to red. So green is like you're cruising, things are going well. Yellow, things come up, whether it's starting a company, changing jobs, having kids, going through a breakup, a divorce. And red is more of the kind of long-term clinical issues like depression, anxiety, bipolar OCD, and so forth. And the whole idea is to triage people to the right care based on their need, versus saying, okay, let's wait till someone's in crisis mode and then treat them vis-a-vis high-cost psychotherapy, or hope that this digital app we built solves it. And so the reality is there's no one size fits all for mental health. And so I think a really important way to solve this is to make sure incentives are aligned and triage people to the right care based on their need versus saying, okay, there's this one solution and this is it for these people and it has to treat that full spectrum, because the reality is that's probably not going to work, right? Everyone has a different way in which they treat their mental health, just like we all have different ways in which we treat our own physical health. And so what we've seen to work well is building a model where we actually do check each of those boxes and we do triage people to the right level of care, and we do triage someone to a therapist should they need it, but we don't just proactively do that unless they need it. They might work with a coach or they might do some sort of digital program. And so catering to that full spectrum has been a way where we can align incentives versus the analogy we think of a lot of is like, if you hurt your knee, would you go right to an orthopedic surgeon and get knee surgery? Probably not, right? Hopefully not. You want maybe get some physical therapy, get an MRI, right? We want to create the same kind of system in the mental health space so that all of us have access to resources that we can all benefit from versus waiting until we're in crisis mode and then hopeful that some employer that we work for has access to psychotherapy. And so I think that's kind of a long-winded response of saying that taking a more holistic approach where incentives are aligned at every step of the way is crucial to building a sustainable model.
Great. And Sarah, what do you tell the founders that you're working with who come to you and say, I want to make the world a better place, and I know that if I want my company to survive, I need to make money?
Yeah. So usually, often we're starting in that very early conversation, and I think what can be very impactful is if you're in that space of starting a mental health company, feeling inspired to start a mental health company, walking down that journey, thinking about why you're doing it, and really cementing what that story is, what that narrative is, why it's important, whether it's statistics, whether it's personal experience, whether it's any combination of things, and what that is with your founding team, your fan club, whoever the supporters are. And I think from that place, if you look at what that inspiration is and you combine it with, as a team, the people we have access to, the people we can recruit, the areas that we know well, where's our strategic advantage? If you look at those things together, very often you can find a place where you can move forward. And if you get the right people on board, you have a little room to experiment to figure out what the real model is. And so my general advice is to be very careful about who your investors are, particularly as you're getting towards a Series A and you're giving up board seats, if your goal is to be impactful. Because there's a lot of companies that might be, in the end sold as pieces for data, all sorts of reasons. And it really sucks if everyone who was part of building that company was doing it for a very different purpose and reason. So just thinking about, what are your goals, being aware of that early on. How is this product, if you're successful? So what? Is it going to make a big difference? What's that path? How could it go wrong? How could someone sort of want to manipulate it into something it's not meant to be? And making sure that you're clear on that and aligned. And some of it you can figure it out as you go. I think the value space is an important one. Sort of the opposite answer.
You're getting a number of different perspectives tonight, which is great. And here's another question. I'd like to talk a little bit more about the opportunity space in digital mental health. So there are a lot of people here who either think they've got the best idea for the next digital mental health company or are hoping to find it. And we can't all do the same thing either, right? So I'd love to ask this panel where you see particular opportunities in the digital mental health space now. And Alyson, I know you're going to say your own company, the space you're in, but for fun, let's play around with what you would recommend to someone who's not affiliated with your company. What are the opportunities, the real gaps in the digital mental health space where you're not seeing a lot of players? And theoretically, if done right, there could be a number of opportunities in that area.
So it's kind of a cheap answer, but honestly, the biggest answer that we've learned, especially by selling into the employer space, which the main reason behind that is one, my background, and two, just in terms of distribution. When you sign up an employer that has 50,000 employees, right away you have access to a much larger number of lives than should you try to kind of growth hack it through direct to consumer. So that's just a strategic decision we made. But the kind of cheap answer is wherever you have engagement. right? So if you do build something that can go viral in the direct-to-consumer space and you're seeing that there's adoption, it allows you to iterate faster, right? So the best products out there, and this is something we learned when we went through Y Combinator, is make something people want, right? So at the end of the day, if you build the most clinically effective app and you have 5 users, like unfortunately, that's probably just not going to get to the level of impact that you are dreaming to have, right? And so the first thing to think about when you're building a product, whether it's for adults or teens or a certain subset of the population, talking to your users, talking to individuals, and understanding what will get them, what do they want to do to engage in their mental well-being. For me, it's working with a coach, right? For other people, it's a therapist. For other people, it's a digital app, it's meditation, right? It's all these different kind of prongs to the overarching mental health umbrella, if you will. And so I think the short answer is like focusing on something that people will actually use, and that helps you iterate your product over time so that it can be even more effective. But if no one uses your product, no matter how effective it is, it's kind of a moot point, right? So that's like step 1. And then step 2, I think it's easy to think, okay, I'm going to build this tool that helps like the entire population. But what we're seeing have great, when we look at even just like the digital health space, broadly speaking, is if you can find some sort of niche, and it's usually because you have some personal story or tie to it, where you're able to build something for that specific subset of the population that's super engaging, and then you can continue to scale that and build it over time. And so for us, again, it was the employer space. I think what's interesting and exciting for me to see is also in the adolescent space, seeing at school. I dream of a day where mental health is a class that all kids have to take throughout high school, right? Like that should be the same way we
So
have.
do I.
Right?
I literally dream about that.
We have physical education course, like you take PE class, right, growing up, or you have gym class. Like why is like mental health not part of that? And part of it is we actually live in a different world today than we have in the past. So we talk about this a lot at no, you're good. Go on in. And sorry if I'm rambling, but we talk about this a lot at Modern Health, that if you think about the human body, so at kind of like a biological level or neurological level, we look pretty much the same as we did hundreds of years, even thousands of years ago, right? Then you think about the rate at which civilization and technology has advanced. It's crazy. So we're basically have an operating system from thousands of years ago that is living in a world today where we have, I have my phone in my pocket. We didn't have smartphones even 2 decades ago. And so the world that we live in, where we're constantly connected to technology, and there is this kind of stress of feeling like we always need to be connected, actually we haven't created new neural pathways in our brain to be resilient to the world that we all live in today. So right now, every single person in this room, not to scare you, but we're all at higher risk for things like depression than we ever have been before, just because of the world that we operate and live in today. And so part of what is really, I guess, inspiring for us is to think about different solutions that give folks the tools to be resilient to the world we live in today. So as an example, like in high school, making a course part of something that everyone does, because it does impact us more. Kids have cell phones now. They have access to social media. That didn't used to be the case a couple decades ago. We now have to just be more realistic about the world that we live in versus this is doomsday, right? It's like, okay, well, this is the world that we live in, and there are some great outcomes from the technological advances that we've seen. So I think it's more about setting ourselves up for success in the world that we live in. But I'm really excited to see what people are doing, since we're focused on employers, what people are doing in more of the kind of education school space.
Thank you. Sarah, opportunity spaces, digital mental health.
So one of the areas that I'm really excited about is historically, if you look at this space, and I've been in it for 10 years, right? It goes back further than that, is in general what we've had the last 10 years is a lot of technologists who wake up one day and say, I'm going to build a mental health company. And there's a lot of power in that. There's all sorts of tools. There's a perspective. It's great. And more recently, we've had, I'm a technologist, and I'm going to partner with a clinician. Or I'm going to hire a clinician. I'm going to get them as an advisor. Sort of where it is now, I think. And the tools are, I would say in general, better and more efficacious than they were before that partnering with the clinician. But where I think there's really a lot of unexplored space is what does it look like to deeply partner across disciplines as you're figuring out what your product is. The most obvious example is technology and someone who specializes in either clinical research or clinical care, depending on what you care about our positive psychology or some research area that's applicable. But also noticing that most academics have just the way the system works, a specific specialty. And so what does it look like to think across those boundaries and look at what would a full spectrum of care look like? How do we want to be approaching people? And if you throw in an artist or you throw in, a big influencer from Instagram, like it's probably gonna help. So I'm excited about those interdisciplinary sort of intersectional opportunities. And I think there's a lot of room there because it just hasn't been done yet.
Thank you. And Margaret?
I'm going to add a tiny little bit because I agree with both of those, but I think that I would add two things. The first thing I would add is to really be thinking about unmet needs. And everybody in this room is here for a reason, and there are probably unmet needs that you find really compelling out there. And I know probably the three of us here have all looked at the 300-400 digital mental health companies that are out there. So it's hard to say a space where no one is innovating. I think there's lots of great innovation going on. I think the one that we haven't talked about yet, there are things around prediction and navigation, and I think both of those are really important spaces. So better matching people with resources that will be effective for them, and that's a piece of what you all are doing. But I think that that's a place where technology and kind of some of the magic of and the strengths of technology can come into play in a way where if it's combined with a deeper clinical understanding and, to Sarah's point, an understanding of social influence, we can probably begin to build some better tools to help people effectively navigate resources. Resources that we've always known about, clinicians, and other resources that may be supportive to and helpful for mental health. So I think that's a creative, interesting mashup as well.
One other thing I'll add. So as we all know, one of the hardest things about mental health is we can't just cut open our brains and figure out what's going on, right? So it's all self-reported. And so it's different than any other, I guess you could say, element in the healthcare system. If you hurt your elbow or you break your knee, you can very clearly figure out that something's going on. Well, the hardest thing to identify is mental health because it's all self-reported. So I could say I'm feeling a certain way someday, and it could change the other day, and it could be very different just based on my perspective and your perspective. And so I think one area that's really fascinating in space where honestly there hasn't been a great solution is on building some sort of assessment that makes it really easy and is consistent for someone to identify where they are in their mental health journey. And so, the kind of the industry standard are these kind of old school assessments, the PHQ-9 and GAD-7 that you guys have all heard of, or the WHO-5, and we're culprits of using all that stuff too, because that's just what's accepted in research, and that's kind of what you have to do. But they kind of suck. Who wants to take those? First of all, you could take it one day and your answers could change a week later. So I think building a really robust assessment that could get someone at tracking themselves the same way we have Fitbits that can track your steps. I don't know what that looks like, but I think that that's something that would be super interesting to give ourselves the tools to see how am I, kind of self-care. How can I track how I'm doing just the same way you can track your weight?
And just building on that, I had a really interesting conversation with a really amazing neuroscientist who has developed a way to what he says is a way to diagnose schizophrenia through eye movement. And so it was interesting. We were talking about it and we said, okay, that's great. And then that's an innovation, but how that goes to market is really the interesting question there. It's not immediate. It's not like, okay, great, now we have a new way to diagnose it. That doesn't solve a need that goes all the way down to the person who's being diagnosed or treated, and it goes through all sorts of challenging, thorny legal, regulatory, and privacy things along the way. So I think when you see when there are these interesting kernels of, wow, here's an innovation that has the potential to do something powerfully and more objectively, it still has to be put into practice in a system that isn't necessarily great at doing all that. So I think that's an interesting piece of this as well.
And as an adolescent clinical psychologist, I would be remiss if I didn't also mention the fact that most companies are in the adult mental health space, and a lot of companies who have a mission to support adolescent mental health end up pivoting because they realize it's just so much easier to work with adults first for some of the reasons that Margaret mentioned and others. So opportunity certainly exists in that space. That's one of the many reasons so focused on it at Hopelab. All right, so we're gonna get real. I want to talk about the challenges of mental health companies as a space that are unique to other areas in which one could start a company. I think a lot of people who are founders in the mental health space do so because they're mission driven. Either they have a personal experience or a connection to the area in which they're working. But the unintended side effects that could come up, with all different kinds of companies, might be particularly bad with mental health. If you deliver an intervention over chat or over chat bot and you're thinking that you're trying to help someone, you could accidentally lead them to get even closer to suicide than they were before they interacted with your bot, and who knows what comes of that, right? So I'd love for the panel to comment on unintended side effects of digital mental health tech, whether you've either seen something in particular that's been a challenge that you think folks in this room should be looking out for, or how you're thinking about it in your work today.
So question is unintended effects of
What could go wrong with digital mental health products?
Yeah,
and how are you thinking about that at Modern Health in your case?
Yeah, for sure. So I think, so part of the problem is, right, there's no one size fits all approach. And so there's different things that work for different people. And while chatting with a bot could work really well for someone, it might actually be detrimental for that other person. And so understanding what the best kind of triage of care is a way that we think about it. One of the kind of, and this goes back to the assessment piece, right? So the way in which we assess people and kind of triage them to the level of care based on their need is based on an assessment and how they would be chatting with us, right? Or talking to us on the phone. But there's always margin for error there because it's self-reported. So someone could fill out an assessment and they don't want to chat with a coach. They don't want to pick up the phone, in which case the assessment could potentially be inaccurate. It could say that they're doing better than they are or worse than they are. And so one way in which we're trying to, tackle that is coming at it from multiple angles. So not only doing additional assessments and kind of triggering assessments if someone falls below a certain score, having outreach from a coach, having outreach from a provider. But I think that's one of the biggest issues that we deal with is evaluating kind of where someone's mental health is, and knowing that because it's self-reported, it could very well be inaccurate, and you could end up triaging someone to a digital program when they really are suicidal. You don't know, just because of how they filled out the assessment.
I mean, I had a conversation today with somebody who was talking about a peer support program. And I mean, I am very bullish on peer support. I think it's something that can be really important and efficacious, and really it does one of the important things that we have to talk about, which is how do you extend the potential labor force to help people manage mental health conditions. And in this particular case, what had happened was the variability of the ability of those peers to be effective coaches and responders had in the rollout of this had resulted in the program being pulled back because they had so much variability among the peers that they couldn't guarantee that it's similar that they'd be able to escalate appropriately. Mm-hmm. So that's an interesting example where you take a concept that I think people feel great about, but there's so much in the execution, and then you get to a place where you think, oh my gosh, we have to train and credential and license them the same way that we're training and credentialing and licensing traditional clinicians, and then you lose a lot of the cost advantage. So I think that's a really interesting challenge that I've seen with some of what I think are some of the really interesting solutions that we've got to figure out. Yeah.
So I'll give a specific example without naming a specific company, which is imagine you have a company and there's it sounds like similar to what you guys have. There's an assessment in the beginning. And so the assessment's probably a well-designed mashup of these different assessments. And at the end, the system will have a score for someone, different risk factors, different potential diagnoses. And so you're this company. And then you're looking at, we want to have more users who actually are buy a button and convert. Where are we losing them? So your system's already working. Some people are buying it. Press has written about it. It's started working. But you're looking at, okay, well, where are we losing people? What do we want to change? And so you start doing some analysis. You look at your churn. And you figure out that the biggest place is initially when you're looking at your potential users. And you're saying to 30% of them, like, this isn't actually a good fit for you. we actually recommend that you do this other thing. It could be calling, 911. It could be looking for a therapist in your area with a link to NAMI. It's very well intentioned, very thoughtfully designed. And so you sort of have this awareness that the numbers of people who are out there who are really looking for help, as Danielle said, are quite high. And where are they going to access it? And in what format are they actually willing to do it? And what's available in their area? And so I think you quickly, as a well-intentioned person, get into this gray area of, is it better to have something that is accessible, even if it's not the best thing for that person, that they'll engage with, that might build trust, maybe through whatever you're giving them, they'll learn more about what therapy actually is or what happens when you call one of those crisis numbers. Or do you want to say, no, this isn't right for you? And there's a lot of details in this, right? I mean, there's liability, there's clinical concerns, there's standards of care, there's all sorts of guidelines depending on what you're really doing. But I think what's important is that when we're thinking about it, we're comparing what is actually happening in these communities as they are with what does it look like when you bring this resource. And most of the studies don't actually look at that disparity. They look at the standard of care for people who can get it, probably in an academic hospital, versus what you're doing that's different. So I think that's a broader question for the field, but we're thinking about.
Great, thank you. I'd like to get into the nitty gritty now of some of the advice you all have and some of the experiences you've had in the early stage companies you've founded or been involved with or invested in. And I'd like to start with Alyson and have you comment on very, very early on, how did you go from idea to evaluating product market fit?
Like I'm talking too much, but okay, I'll go.
Don't worry, I'll ask the rest.
Okay.
The other two questions.
Put a muzzle on. I'm from the East Coast, so I can go on and on. So some of the early, I guess, okay, I'll start at like the beginning. So I think the easiest thing is obviously when you're super passionate about something. So for me, the mental health space has always been something that I'm really passionate about for personal reasons, family reasons, right? We usually have some sort of tie to it. And so it's always kind of been in the back of my head as something that I wanted to find a way to make an impact. And when I was at Collective Health, I think it really helped me to just get exposure to the space and also working in a startup. So I think working in a startup actually gives you kind of exposure to how things get run. And if you join an even earlier stage startup, it can kind of allow you to dip your toes into different areas, because when you do take the plunge and start a company, it is like, how do you even incorporate a company and set it up, right? Like there's these questions where you're like, what, how does this work? And I think for me, it was finding honestly, like I call it a buddy, but a partner or someone who might be a year or 2 years ahead of you in that process, who has done it, who can help guide you along the way, because it's scary. And you kind of have to have a little bit of this irrational optimism. And I think it's consistent with most founders, is that optimism is what keeps you going and is what will make you successful. You have to like intrinsically believe that what you're going to build will be successful. And it's much less about the product or the app or whatever it is you're building. It's about the problem that you're solving. And if you're passionate enough about the specific problem that you're solving, you will find a way to be successful. You will iterate. I can guarantee that whatever idea that all of you guys have in your head right now, even what we were building at Modern Health, with 100% guarantee is not going to be the thing that is necessarily the right thing to build. And so part of it is actually caring much more about the problem that you want to solve and being flexible to iterate to solve that problem. Part of like what we do at Modern Health, we have a roadmap, but again, with 100% guarantee, I can tell you that roadmap's not accurate. And it's just because we know that as we talk to more users, as we get more data, that we're going to iterate on that. So I think that's really important. And in the early stages, finding that kind of buddy who can help you understand what it means to take that first step of quitting your jobs and kind of taking a plunge is super helpful. And relying on your network, like don't be afraid to tap on each other and ask for help. I think I was like nervous to send cold LinkedIn messages and like cold email people. Ruthless about it now. Like you have to just like go crazy. And eventually like someone's gonna help. Like hopefully more people will than not, but someone will pay it forward. And you have to think about it. You have to have that level of optimism. And so don't be afraid to reach out to people like us, to other people who have done it, who have paved the way, because like we have to pay it forward too. We didn't get here because we figure it out on our own. There's other people that taught us along the way. And so I think the biggest thing is being vocal about asking other people for help and not being afraid that you don't know how to do it, because everyone doesn't know how to do it when they start. And so just being okay to be vulnerable in that and know that like it's okay when it's scary. Asking for help is really the only way you can do it.
Great. And then Sarah, I'd like you to take it just one step further for us. What should people be thinking about and looking for in not only a mentoring team, but also thinking about assembling an advisory board?
I think it depends on the starting place and how early the company is and how flexible it is as well. So if you know what you're going after or you know the area, it's relatively easy to find who are the best people in the field and who's interested in this intersection with technology and entrepreneurship and has the time and has a connection with you and wants to help.
Any thoughts on advisory board?
Well, yeah, but first I want to ask a question. So how many people here are starting or thinking about starting a company right now? Okay, lots of people. And of you guys, how many of you have the seeds of something or think you have something that is protectable from an intellectual property perspective versus, so that's category 1, raise your hands. Okay. Versus how many feel like you're doing something where it's going to be execution that's going to be what differentiates you or takes you forward. So, there are very different paths, right? We talked about this a little bit beforehand, and the advisors and the mentors that you need, depending on which of those paths you're going down, and who you need to be as a team are different depending on which of those paths you're going down. And, I think that's an important thing to be thinking about is sort of what is the risk that you need to be working on in the early stages of the company? Is it technology risk? Is it regulatory risk? Is it team risk? Is it execution risk? And then think about making sure that you have the right complement of people both on the team and around you as advisors to try to kind of knock down that risk. I think it's sort of that hard and that simple. So that's a thought I would.
And to add to that,
yeah.
What do you need to do really, really well, and what do you just need to do good enough? Because depending on your company, you might have to be really good at sales. You might have to be really good on the technical side and the integration of hardware and software. You might have to be really good at selling to large companies, which is a very different type of sales or engagement and sort of gamification. So knowing that also helps with the advisors. To some extent, I think the advisors can be sort of flexible and change as you grow, depending on how you set it up as well.
Great. So let's move to funding, because if it wasn't already on people's minds, I'm sure that's one of the main reasons you're here, is to hear these women's perspective on funding, at least in part tonight. So Margaret, maybe we should start with you. What are you thinking about when a founder comes to you and says, I've got this great idea, do you think it's fundable?
Sure. So, well, some of it depends on the kind of the question. So I asked a series of questions, but I think, the first one, and this is something I was going to say in the last question, but I think it's equally relevant here, which is I usually know who's out there in the space pretty well. And so what I wouldn't say to somebody is, because there's another company out there doing this, you shouldn't try to do it. But what I will ask you is, how are you differentiated from, or how are you going to be able to compete with that company? Because that's just question number 1. And I think that's a really, really important piece to think about. And that could be, we have some IP. That could be, we've got this great team with this advisory group. We've got this insight around technology that's going to fundamentally change the way we take it to market. We might have we might have a great customer base that we have because of some set of relationships that we have. So that's the first thing I'm going to look at, because in most cases there will be somebody, certainly of the things that I look at, because I look at tech and services, not biologic therapeutics, where you're going to tend to have IP devices. And so that's the first thing, is that there are other people out there doing it, and an investor or funder will generally know who they are and know what they're doing, or you hope they do. And then you want to be thinking about what that story is, about why you're different and why you have the potential to be successful. And it might be that 5 or 10 companies are going to be successful in the space. So it might be that, we think we have a real ability to get a footprint in this region, And so that's going to be the way we start. And then we can, land and expand from there. So that would be one thing. I think that the sort of passion, story, grit, hustle component is a really, really important one. And so that's something that I need to see. And that can come, Alyson talked about it, and Sarah talks about it all the time. That's something that, again, investors look at a lot of companies and talk to a lot of entrepreneurs. So that's something that people are always looking for. I think your willingness and ability, particularly if you are not a brilliant technologist and a brilliant clinician all in one, your flexibility and ability to collaborate and work well with others and actually take advice and input from investors and advisors is another really important quality and characteristic. But I think this resilience, grit, recognition that you're going to have to pivot several times, and belief that you're idealistic enough to believe that you can make this happen, but you're not so attached to the way it's going to happen that you're not willing to pivot to make that happen. I could go on forever, but that's a few things. You guys should talk about some other.
By Angela Duckworth's.
Yeah.
Duckworth's Bum Grit.
What else do you
Sarah,
add
what
to that,
can
Sarah?
you add to this that you tell your founders?
What I would look at first is what part of the business is really working. Even if you've only tried it on 20 people, even if you've been doing paper prototyping, like if you look at all of the potential metrics you could have, what's working. And usually if you do it for long enough, you'll find something that you're pretty good at, a lot of things you're really bad at. And if the something you're really good at is a real metric, probably the right direction to start. And as you have real conversations with investors, not just, I'm thinking of doing this, what do you think? But you're actually pitching them, pitch it around that metric that's really working and say, this is what we've been focusing on. There's a lot of other stuff. We just haven't really gotten there yet, but look how great our growth is. Or look how good our acquisition of therapists is. Or you can pick the metric that you really present to them. So I'd say early on, I think it's what is working really well, and then connect that to how does that matter, right? If that's working really well and it continues to work really well, as an investor making a lot of assumptions, but that's okay. Show me how it matters, right? The classic version would be, how big is that market? How big is your total addressable market? If it's more impact-based, it might be, what does that impact look like, or some fusion of them. And then for the later stages, I don't think you need this as early, it's can you build a moat? So what are you doing, whether it's IP or not IP is one of the ways. Having an exclusive partnership around supply or around you're selling to is another one. There's a bunch of these things. What makes it really hard for someone to catch up to you? And the benefit of mental health being hard and regulated is there's actually a lot of these things in healthcare, right? Like the FDA is challenging, a little less challenging than it's been historically, but still challenging. But if you do that, that's a moat, right? There's a lot of these things.
I mean, one other piece just to bring up, because it happens a lot. I mean, I mostly look at impact investment, and so a lot of times I do get people who come to me and say, I care about impact, and therefore, and I couldn't get any traditional investor to invest, but because you're an impact investor and I care about impact, you'll invest in me. And I think that one of you said it earlier, there will be no impact if the business is not viable. And so I am looking for both. And impact investors, in some ways, I think a lot of people think, oh, I'll go to an impact investor and it'll be easier than going to a traditional venture or angel investor, and it's not. And so I think that having a go-to-market strategy and a viable business model doesn't have to be necessarily it doesn't have to be the level of profitability or the market size that a commercially viable entity would have to be, but it does nevertheless have to have a viable business model, or it's going to be very hard. Now, on the positive side, you can often get an impact investor or an impact-focused angel to come with you, and you can an angel in the commercial sector early while you're trying to prove that out. And so I think looking for those opportunities, but recognizing that a big part of what you've got to do up front is make a case for how you're going to be viable.
The other thing I would add is expect 100 conversations.
Yeah. Don't get discouraged by having hundreds.
Expect at least 100, if not hundreds and hundreds.
Anything.
And most of those will be no's.
Yeah.
And that's
why you have to be resilient and gritty.
Yeah, exactly.
That's not unique. You get hundreds of no's. It's not unique.
I think for us, it was super beneficial to go through an accelerator program like Y Combinator. So I would highly recommend any accelerator program just to be around other people going through a similar process, because they can obviously help guide you, and you're also getting those no's next to a bunch of other people who are as well. And it makes you feel a lot less worse about yourself, because it honestly, everyone hears, every single company, there's no company out there that has been a billion-dollar company who just had like a straight path towards easy success, right? It doesn't exist. It's inevitably those that are in those times where they have heard no over and over again and probably are failing as a company that you come together and have that level of resiliency and are able to get creative at making something work. And those are the companies that end up being these massive, least successful companies. So I think one is, if you're not in an accelerator program, find someone who has raised money at some point and convince them to help you, and just like ruthlessly find someone. LinkedIn people, we would literally just hit people up on LinkedIn until they would meet with us and like give us their advice on how to do it. It's really helpful to learn from someone who has done it. You would be surprised at what you think is a normal pitch deck and what it actually should be and how it should look. So that's kind of my first real advice at what I would do. The other thing that we learned, I think that was helpful in YC, is there's usually 3 things and you need to nail one of them really well. So one is team. Do you have the team that has the X factor, that has what it takes to be more successful than anyone else and what you're trying to solve? So that's number 1. Number 2 is traction in any form. So you either have engagement, you have started to prove out the efficacy of something, you have actual traction with the business or people, you have paying customers, some version of traction that shows you have built something that someone out there wants and will use. And then the third is the market, right? The size of the market opportunity and whatever unique insight you have into that will allow you to be more successful than anyone else. Have to nail at least one of those in order to be honestly successful in the fundraising process as we learned it at YC. And that was super helpful because it allowed us to just like focus on building our story around one of those. If you can do 2, that's great. Obviously, if you have 3, you can nail it. It's hard to do that at the really early stages. And so finding which one of those things you're really good at and marrying your story around that is super helpful when you're putting your pitch together.
All right, well, I could do this all night, but I want to give you a chance to ask the panel some questions. So I just want to round it out with something fun. And I'd like to ask the panelists to keep the answer to this question to one idea expressed in one line. Where will digital mental health be in 10 years? Sarah.
One line. It sounds like an interpretive dance.
Yeah.
Like, are you looking for a prop?
A line on a piece of paper, 8.5 by 11, 12 point times New Roman.
Great. I hope that it'll be integrated more into general healthcare, because there's no reason for it to be separate, and that we use a lot of these sphere tools that are being built today and that some of you are building to be integrated into a platform that really helps people.
Alyson.
Ooh, this is hard. Probably not really a normal answer to this, but sorry, it's many senses. Finding out, like understanding and having a unique insight into what is like more from a proactive and preventive perspective, like what is causing this level of distress that we all feel in our everyday lives that's impacting kids all the way up through adults. We're all impacted. And I think we often think about these reactive tools that can help, whether it's CBT or in-person talk therapy or medication management. But why is there such this ever increasing demand for these services? And I'm excited to see in the future a better understanding of what is causing all this in our lives and what the impact is with technology and how we can live in a world where it's not this very dystopian, morbid outlook of our future, but like a happy place that we can all live and thrive in.
I love that. I want to be in that world.
I think we all do. That's why we're all here, right? Yeah.
Margaret.
Mine relates to that one, which is I'm really fascinated by, and I hope 10 years from now we have really magical combinations of human and tech in ways that can really bring what we need from the human touch and what we can benefit from in technology together in ways that can, I think, really help people have better well-being and better connection.
Amazing. And with that, I want to formally thank this outstanding panel. Well, I would love to open up the opportunity for this room to ask the panel a few questions. And I believe there's one from you, but we are, please feel free to ask the panelists questions. And what I would ask is that you please just keep your question to one of our panelists, just in the interest of time, to make sure we can get as many questions as possible in the little time we have this evening. Would you like to start? First hand.
And mine's not centered to any one of the panelists, but rather whichever feels
I will
most
pick the one. I have 3 kids. I'll pick the one.
A hypothetical question on the realm of addressing teens as well as preventative mental health care. If you were in charge of Facebook and designated, and your mission was, I want to make this tool designed to actually really improve everyone's mental well-being, how would you go about it, and what would change?
I would love to direct that toward the president and CEO of a company that is trying to make digital solutions to impact adolescent health and emotional well-being. If you don't mind me putting you on the spot, putting you on the spot, Margaret.
Yeah. No, I think the way that I would answer that, Dan, is I feel like, and saying this, there are probably people in this room who know about a number of these things that are going on at Facebook. So let's assume that, there are some good people that are working on these things. But I think getting young people much more engaged in what would a positive experience of Facebook be? And we do all this work. We do a lot of work at Hopelab with young people, understanding the experience they have in social media. And I wonder to what extent that work has really been done to understand deeply with the people at Facebook who are developing these solutions, with the people at Facebook who are working on how Facebook monetizes, how Facebook develops its business model. How much do we understand from young people who are really trying to address issues with their own mental health and with mental health and well-being of their friends? How might they inspire and inform the design of features on Facebook and of sort of ways that Facebook evolves? Or limitations of Facebook and the way it evolves. So I would love to see that report out of sort of, if you brought together, the best bring change to mind clubs in the high schools around the country who are trying to work on this in their schools with engineers and decision makers at Facebook, what might they come up with? So I might try to mash those two up.
And I'll just add that that's not very hard to do. So in my research lab in the Department of Psychiatry at UCSF, when I wanted to figure out how to use Facebook to help young LGBTQ young adults in the United States quit smoking, I just ran focus groups on Facebook and people came in droves. They were dying to share with us their experiences of smoking and of social media use through social media, just to tell us about pain points and tell us about areas of opportunity there. And we knew that we couldn't develop an efficacious intervention. I know how to help someone quit smoking, but I didn't know how to help a young person quit smoking through Facebook without asking them directly.
And I think the other thing I would say is it's not really Facebook anymore. So I almost feel like this is kind of where do we go to? Is it Snapchat and Twitch and Instagram, and is it really Facebook? But the point is the point, right? The theory is the same.
Great. In the back, yes.
Hi. This is for whoever has seen the most number of failed mental health startups in the past. Can you share lessons regarding engagement, retention, utilization? Because that seems to be a case in B2C startups, and even in B2B, utilization is a problem. So any lessons learned that aspiring startups should not do, or
I'm gonna ask Sarah.
Right?
That's a really big question. I'm trying to think of a specific answer. First, do you want to make a more specific version of the question?
Yeah, like some really obvious mistakes somebody, or like, lantern, not that I want to share lantern story, but like, anything that you learned about engagement, retention, utilization, because I hear again and again, that's the biggest risk when it comes to product and mental health. What are some basic mistakes to not make, or like obvious?
I would say the biggest one far and away, that is going to sound so obvious when I say it, but that I see that lots of companies skipping, is really talking to the end users. Like, who is the person who identifies with the way that you're promoting this? Maybe it's the language mental health, maybe it's not the language mental health. And do they actually want what you're building? So a lot of people focus on, is the thing you're building going to be helpful for that person? Are you going to be able to get it in front of them? Will someone recommend it to them? Will someone pay for it for them? But is this something that they really want? And is it in language and tone and in a way that they really want? And you can borrow from what's been successful in other technology businesses to a certain extent, like Amazon or games, but this audience is very different, and there's so many subtypes of the audience. Like, if you're trying to focus on people with OCD versus depression, it's completely different.
It's interesting that the sort of what people want. The statistic that hit me last week so powerfully, and is Bumble adds 500,000 users a day. Wow, a day. People want it. How do we get some of these things into the places where people are going because they have a need or a want or a desire that they're trying to get met?
And to Margaret's response to the previous question, I think designing with these end users and figuring out how to make it really comfortable for them so that they tell whoever they're with, you guys, what is true and how they would really respond to something, which Hopelab does a ton of this, is super important. And don't just also include caregivers and clinicians, but don't take their word in terms of what an end user really wants.
Weston.
So that's actually a great segue into my question, which is going to be for Alyson. So you talked about this kind of green, yellow, red, and I'm a psychiatrist. I do some inpatient work, and I see people in the red a lot. And one of the classic elements of people in the red in almost any disorder is a lack of insight as things get worse, which also means oftentimes a lack of desire for services. So how are you thinking about with that population that you're working with? How are you thinking about how to engage people who at their core, as they get worse, wish to engage less?
So the way in which, great question. So the way in which we've tackled this, and it's had the best success to date of all the different ways in which you could try to tackle this, is by honestly removing the stigma and taboo with even the words mental health and depression. We actually did a research study, and we asked people about 2 years ago, employees all around the world, what would cause you to reach out and get support from a therapist, friend, mentor, coach, family member, advisor. And it was just a free form survey. Less than 10 people actually just filled out depression. It was certain things in their life that felt relatable, or events that were happening that got people to engage. So the way in which we actually have, the way our product works is during the onboarding, you can pick these different categories or areas that you want to focus on. And it might be relationships, stress, anxiety, financial stress is one, diversity and inclusion is one. And so there's these things that have actually, they lower the barrier to entry because we've removed the stigma of just saying you're struggling with severe depression and you need to put yourself in this box for something that's offered by your employer. And so it's been a way to get people to engage that feels much more relatable, because it's easy to say that, or it's a lot easier to engage in something when it feels like it's something that a lot of people deal with, right? And that they're not alone. So that's one of the easiest ways in which we've been able to get those types of folks to engage in getting support from a therapist or psychiatrist.
We have time for one more in the back.
Do you have anything else on that before?
Good turn, Danielle.
I understand this question to be people who lack insight, right? So then they lack insight, and they're not going to reach out for help. They're not, because they don't think they have a problem.
Is that I still have kind of the same answer. So it's while you're getting someone onboarded. So like if no one's going to reach out at all, you can't force someone to engage in their health, right? Like we're not going to be, at least at Modern Health, that's not going to be our initial focus on solving. The first step is lowering the barrier to entry, and the way in which you do that, and someone who might not have otherwise reached out, is by putting something on there that feels comfortable to check that box. So as an example, we rolled out with a law firm, and they were like, there's no way you're going to get your book of business 30% engagement, which is using our platform, working with a coach or therapist. We had over 30% engagement within the first 2 months. And 50% of the male dominant workforce, over 50% of the engagement came through financial well-being, had nothing to do with it. It was stress, anxiety, depression, OCD, everything you can imagine. But they felt comfortable checking that box and coming through the door and then getting triaged to a therapist.
One thing that I will add about those red times that I'm also familiar with as a clinician is that an area of opportunity with digital technology in the mental health space is that it might be better than we are, if it's good, it's better than we are ourselves at evaluating when we're getting toward orange and red, or it can be better at knowing when we're red when we don't want to reach out. And there are a lot of examples of that, right? I was just listening to a podcast yesterday that Margaret recommended to me of Reid Hoffman interviewing Nancy Loveland, who started Crisis Text Line. And she was talking about, we had a real problem in the beginning. We had so many users, but only some of them were in crisis, and we were really a service for those in crisis. So we had to learn how to predict when people were in crisis. And some of us in the room might be using strategies like natural language processing, which they started to use to say, what is the language that people text that's most associated with those red times? To be able to say, we got to triage in a very systematic way the calls that we should be prioritizing, right? And then there are companies in that space doing things like evaluating what we type into our phone, what we email, who we call, et cetera, to be able to predict things that are getting closer to red, like relapse addiction, which is a time, addiction relapse, which is a time when people tend not to reach out, right? So there's kind of this twofold problem. One is, how do you get the people most in who may be dealing with stigma or not knowing what's going on with them, but then also that red time is particularly challenging. So why not take advantage of the fact that we've got this thing in our pockets that might know when we're getting toward red before we reach.
And also, how do you design the experience on the user side so that when the technology knows they're red,
It's not creepy.
does something useful and not creepy?
Yeah.
Particularly for people who have a tendency to be in the red every now and again, because their perception of the technology is going to matter a lot. So I think there's a huge place for design and that user experience side in all of this, especially that area.
And the last question is the gentleman in the back, who I didn't mean to. Please.
I have a question for Alyson. So you seem to like touch up on a lot of analogies with physical health and have like a vision of like harnessing the pros of physical health in society. And while there's like of course cons with it, like all the talk of like broken healthcare system, if we were to like start from scratch and not reason by analogy, how would you like envision merging both physical and mental health as like health in general in a overall like healthcare system, or even like is it easier to like target markets by like seeing what's successful out there in the physical health space and like building on top of that?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think the short answer is we like the analogy, 12 analogies of primary care. Like if you have your ideal state in the world of what primary care looks like, we need to have the same exact thing with behavioral health. What happens in these days is a lot of folks go to their primary care, right, their PCP, and they say, hey, I'm struggling with X, and their primary care physician might put them on a certain medication and hope that it works, and then they're kind of on their own and they don't get the support that they need, whether it's talk therapy, whether it's CBT, whether it's other evidence-based techniques or solutions. And so I think centering the way we think about physical health, and like of course, we're even in that realm, not at the ideal state of what primary care should look like, but having it be very closely correlated with your mental well-being. Because we've even seen, I mean, there's stats now, it's like 75% of folks who deal with musculoskeletal, so chronic physical things like back pain, are psychosomatic. So the underlying issue is actually behavioral, it might be anxiety. But because we think about treating things in a very reactive way, so it's, oh, let's treat your back pain through physical therapy versus, oh, that anxiety that you're struggling with. So I think actually thinking about it at its core, which there's an ideal world of primary care that I believe and hope we get to someday, and that's closely correlated. So it's almost like this future world where primary care physicians are also trained in behavioral health, and there's almost like a new field of intersection of primary care and psychology. You could probably speak to, the future world of how that could potentially work, but something along those lines of where it's very integrated from the start versus, because it is the root cause of a lot of these comorbidities, right? Cancer, diabetes, hypertension, heart disease. There's a big link to that with our behavioral health and how we're doing. And so somehow integrating that at a much earlier stage, I think is my kind of ideal futuristic hope.
And let's end on hope.
Yay!
By saying thank you so much. Oh, it's so great that we could do this tonight. And thank you all for coming. We have a few extra minutes if you'd like to get to know each other or chat with the panel.
And let's give another round of applause.
I think that all the aggregated data, the anonymous data, is changing technology, developing, can be used as a basis to change policy, more severely. I mean, there's a lot of policies that could be put in place to help them. Do you think that uses that the data is that kind of data that can be reliable enough to
Yes.
Yes.
We just had to do it. Companies like Google and others are doing it now. So yep. And if you have a way to get on that train, the data are useful.
And so we're gonna be here for another like 15 minutes or so until 7:30. And you're welcome to ask questions and mix and mingle and drink. And
We also feel free to wander through Hopelab. There on the lab rooms, you can get a little bit of sense of some of the projects we're working on. So if that's of interest to you, I'm sure some of the Hopelab people here would be happy to
We have resident
tell you
tour
a little bit
guides.
about what's going on. So if that's of interest to you, wander through.
Thank you. And more questions. Thank you.